22 minutes after 11 p.m. Central Africa time. It is time for us to get into conversation with Dr. Nicholas Neaves, a master counselor and a pastoral narrative therapist who has written several books that focus on relationship, emotional healing, and self-reflection, including Letters to Her. This is a collection addressing women on love and self-worth, as well as Unbound, an invitation to deeper connection and intimacy. He joins us on the line this evening, and we're going to use the backdrop of that Tuesday reminder, Doctor, that you had posted that sort of emphasized the necessity of staying curious about your partner. I want us to start off there because I found it really interesting, right? You said something to the effect of get out of your own movie and step into the movie for a short bit. What do you think constitutes to that level of selfishness where you become the prime object in a relationship?
I don't think we can help it, right? I mean, we're all self-referencing the whole time. We live through our own experience and our own five senses. And to be honest with you, there is no such thing as a relationship other than the story that I'm making up about it in my own head, if you really think about it, right? Like there isn't a relationship that you can climb into, like your car, for example, which is a physical entity and you can actually drive your car. We call these things relationships, but they really are just made up imaginary bubbles in our own consciousness and our own thoughts. And it's important to be aware of that. And the key tenet here is to slow down enough and develop enough self-awareness and be able to have an ability to self-reflect upon your own narrative that you're having, your own beliefs, your own feelings. And that gives you a great advantage in relationships because now you're able to also not only think about what you're thinking, you actually realize that other person that you're with, they're doing the exact same thing. They're also having their own experience too. And so there's a beautiful space between two human beings where if we did slow things down enough, we can actually allow two people to have turns in sharing and actually allowing their inner worlds to come forward without the other person jumping in and hijacking that conversation too soon, which is a tough thing to do because anytime anyone starts talking, we are already, forming our own thoughts, feelings, and opinions about what they're saying, and we can't wait but jump in and actually, let them know about us, right, and what we're experiencing and our opinion, and you should do it like this, or why not do that, or whatever it may be. We pro-self, and healthy relationships become a little bit more where we can develop a more pro-social outlook with regards to our experiences with others.
Last week, we had an opportunity to look at the statement, know thyself. And it got me thinking for a second. There are people who are very self-aware. They understand themselves, but that doesn't take away from the ability to practice selfishness. And so what is it about knowing yourself that allows you to accommodate the next person?
Well, I think it's got to do with the understanding of emotion. And so if I can understand why I react to certain things and how I feel about certain things, it makes me curious to wonder, what is it that you thought and felt about what we both just experienced or what's happening in your life? And that's the beauty about relationships is we might be looking at the same thing, but you having a whole different experience to what we're both watching. And healthy relationships are really about turning to that person and understanding them and allowing them to share and, in fact, asking questions to help them reveal more about what it is that you maybe both are looking at, and really loving that and cherishing that other person's opinion and having the ego strength, which means you have enough self-worth inside yourself to be able to rely on their opinion, obviously being different. And that's an important skill to learn as well, is to be able to allow another to have their own thoughts, feelings, and opinions without it knocking you off center or triggering you into such an emotional state that you have to somehow manipulate or control them to change them, to get them to do what you want you to have them do. So it's about the emotional awareness And so that's the beginning point, I think, for any great relationship. And that's where we get that know thyself.
I know that in Letters to Her, you address, to an extent, one of the pillars in the letters is self-worth. Now, I've found that knowing yourself could also be an understanding based on other people, right? I'll give you a silly example. I'm always such a late person, right? That's everybody else's experience of you, right? But there
Right.
could be a reason that isn't
Yeah.
fundamentally identity rooted that makes you
Right.
a late person. And so if you dealt
Mhm.
with that, you'd be punctual. And so how do you know when you've gotten to the crux and core of self?
That's a great question. I don't think we ever really do get to the actual crux. I think we get a good internal understanding and perhaps an architecture of ourselves. But I think there's many different levels to that internal building that we are all discovering every day, as we also experience life and we get to grow and develop. There's certainly temperaments that we're born with and blueprints that we are born with. So there are certain personality structures that we do bring into this world, absolutely. And then we get the nurturing and the nature elements coming in, of course. But certainly, the more we find the meaning behind our behaviors, we start to identify who we are and how we operate. And that certainly could be called our identity. And we reference identity, obviously, through a lot of our belief systems, our character, how we react to certain things in the world. And it's important to get close to that as possible, to have an awareness of that, and realizing it's going to be not perfect, all right? We're going to be doing crazy stuff, and having experiences and feelings. And it's about having that self-compassion to be able to be okay with that and see it more as quirky or, not something that's a major character flaw. But sadly, many of us carry shame and have been deeply wounded to believe that this really is a problem with us. And so we wear masks and we hide these components to ourselves. And that makes relationships way more complicated because then our identity is confused with trauma and other people's beliefs and opinions of us. And so we're living with not just our own identity, but perhaps many other people's identities of us. And, therapy is one process of helping a person unentangle those different experiences to find that one true identity that we do have. But I think it's an ongoing journey to ultimately define that and know it. But I think we can get close. And it's important. It's important to be able to reveal that and say, hey, that's who I am. It helps. It does take a lot of courage and radical acceptance of self.
The voice there of Dr. Nicholas Neaves, who is a master counselor, couples counselor, life coach, and qualified homeopath, joining us this evening. 30 minutes after 11 p.m. Central Africa time. Send through your questions. Find us on WhatsApp, +27 83288 6684. I think on that note of this ever-growing experience of yourself, when would you then indicate it? And this is a question I asked our previous guest as well. When do we know that we are self-aware enough to introduce somebody else into our own space? I think in the first hour we spoke about healing, and it ties in very well into what you're saying, is that sometimes we carry narratives that don't belong to us, and these established through trauma and all kinds of experiences. And so at what stage do you realize, yes, I'm not perfect, yes, I'm a work in progress, but it is okay for me to connect with someone else?
Well, I really do wish we had that level of awareness. I think we would prevent many, many toxic relationships and also major heartaches, and also prevent a lot of family disruption, with children and things, right? Meaning going into relationships that are unhealthy and there's children involved. People sadly do not have that level of self-awareness. And I think it's only in relationship to another that we start to realize different parts of ourselves because of what the other person is bringing up with inside of ourselves, right? And so each unique relationship is going to bring up a unique set of experiences for you that may stir up all kinds of new things that you never knew existed inside of yourself. There's certainly patterns that you will live through in your relationships, and those patterns are important to identify. Those are helpful to know because it helps you predict how you react in conflict or how you react when the person either leaves or come closer to you, for example, in attachment wounds, etc. We can know that stuff. But, when you just meet somebody, it was just the other day I met a new person and I ended up saying things that I haven't said in such a long time, but they just got that out of me. And I was like so surprised and made me think about that. And I went back to those things and I did a little bit of work on that again. And that's the gift of interpersonal relationships, is each of us touch each other in so many unique and wonderful ways. I think a conscious person is somebody who's conscious of that and is willing to take note of what does surface and be accountable for what is surfacing and really work with it if it is something that could be potentially harmful in a future relationship, i.e. a negative pattern in relating, for example, and really do the work on that. So it's only in relationship that we actually develop more of love and more of commitment. We might want to go into relationships to be that, but when you're with that one unique person and you find a beautiful journey happens, and if you look at the long-term committed relationships that are out there, those people will tell you that commitment and their love only really developed as they opened up more to each other over a period of time. And so they developed a unique style, a unique love that was special only to them. And that's really quite beautiful. But yeah, I don't think we ever reach that ground zero, that a point where we know ourselves that perfectly that we can say, okay, I am ready or not ready. I think it's important, though, to be aware of your availability in relationship. In other words, if you've got a lot going on in your life, and you've got a bunch of work stuff or children or whatever it may be aware of your availability and offering before going into dating or relating, because I think that would save a lot of time for a lot of people, and rather set up your relationships that would be more something that would be convenient to your lifestyle. You can define relationships in many different ways. You can choose a lover, for example. You don't have to have a long-term committed relationship. You could meet once every 2 weeks. That's consensual and safe and loving for both partners. It's important to know what you have available inside capacity-wise. I think that is a key thing that we can know for sure.
I want to come back to the context of traumas, and I want to look at it through the lens of your book, An Unbound Heart, right? And this book reflects real experiences of people who have walked through trauma, this including sexual trauma and other kinds, right? And so I not necessarily the focal point being the trauma space, but staying curious while going through trauma. I think that's difficult because people retreat when we're hurt, when we're broken. My brain doesn't have time to be curious. I want to self-soothe. I want to sort of get myself into a space where I feel like I'm me again. How do we stay curious during those times?
Resilience, experience, practicing incremental doses of touching on those wounds, seeing how you react, being there for yourself, having supportive relationships that can be there for you. It's a process. And I think curiosity can only activate within inside of yourself if you are regulated, meaning if the stress response inside your system isn't such that you are dysregulating and you're going to sort of primitive defensive structures within inside your psychology, right? It means being present, and we can only be present if we are allowing and accepting of what we're thinking and experiencing in that moment. In other words, it's not overwhelming us so much that we're having to retreat and move back. And so that's an ongoing process. There's the extent of trauma to a human being is massive. I've worked with some very severe traumas ongoing, chronic, year after year exposure to trauma. And it's the curiosity to be able to invite some of those experiences in for a cup of tea, so to speak, and have a conversation about them to start with, not necessarily actual deep therapeutic work on that or embodiment work around the trauma, but just, hey, this is a unwelcome visitor, but you know what? I can pour it a cup of tea and maybe just start a conversation. So a lot of the work that we do in the practice is about conversation starters, and I think that's where the book came about also, is a lot of those experiences that I share in the book are conversation starters for people, because we touch on different types of trauma. And so I'm hoping it's an invitation once again for people to perhaps relate to those and start conversations about potential healing that's available, and to try different healing modalities to try and unlock some of that pain.
The voice there of Dr. Nicholas Neaves joining us this evening, Master Counsellor, walking us through just the ability to stay curious about your partner and how that unfolds. It's not just questioning everything they do or pretending to be excited about everything they do. It's also working on self, showing up for self. And those are some of the facets of staying curious in relationship. If you have questions, please do find us on WhatsApp +2783 288 6684. A quick breather. When we come back, we wrap up conversations with Dr. Neaves. We are wrapping up conversations with Dr. Nicholas Neaves, who is a master counselor, pastoral narrative therapist, and has written books on relationships, emotional healing, and self-reflection. Just to name 2 letters to her, as well as Unbound Heart. And so we are looking at this context, or this idea of staying curious. And what got me curious about this idea is how we become so complacent in a relationship. We feel like once we've gotten to a certain place where I know your habitual practices, I feel like I know you. And so I'm not curious anymore. I'm not wondering why it is you did what you did. I have a reasoning. In actual fact, heuristics play their role in my brain, and I'm comfortable. And so we are avoiding that. We want to be intentional in our relationships, and Dr. Neaves is helping us do that. Dr. Neaves, as a parting shot for those who are tuned in, who are thinking to themselves, is quite a bit that was mentioned, right? Just in terms of me showing up for myself, me being present so that I can be present for the next, me knowing myself so I can be curious about knowing the next person. How do we begin that journey with self? And I say this because, and I emphasize this, we live in such a fast-paced world. Knowledge about self almost becomes secondary, if not tertiary, in terms of what we need to know. Right? It's like, I need to know my job. I need to know how I'm going to make money. I need to know this, all these forthcoming things. And then knowledge of self becomes that rare thing in the end that you do in the middle of the night when you're sleepy. And so for somebody who's beginning this process of healing, of connecting, of bonding, what's the starting point?
I love that. There's so much depth in what you've just shared there. And, so we want to understand that what often happens in trauma is one of 2 things generally, particularly with men actually, is the identity around self either goes down into a depressive or suppressive, shadowy aspect when there's trauma. In other words, what I'm dealing with is so overwhelming. I'm so out of touch with what's going on. I'm dissociating from my body. And so I suppress the experience. And that goes into you could say, shadow realms. And the other way that people often respond to trauma is they develop like a false mask of protection that can maybe inflate them and make them try and become bigger than and better than, to never be hurt that badly ever again. And so they puff themselves out and they become grandiose and superior. And so out of touch, right, with everyone that's below them, or the peasants below them, so to speak, right? And so understanding those 2 movements when it comes to trauma is helpful, because we can then start to delve into the false self of suppression, or the false self of overinflation of identity, and I'm so great and I'm so amazing, and actually start to do the work in those areas there and help the person understand that there's a true self, and then there's this overinflated self, or there's the suppressed self on this side here. And so it's about shadow work, which means delving into those parts of ourselves that we have perhaps forgotten and are not wanting to really look at because there's such a negativity around them. And it's about being able to integrate and accept that I can make mistakes, that I can be nasty, and I can say horrible things at times. People can perceive me in many ways that would be negative. And so the more I can acknowledge these, and not that I'm acting out on those all the time, but just be aware that there are those aspects to myself in my personality structure. And so the more I allow that to surface, and then faced with the guilt or shame of those aspects of myself, I can then start to actually work with that and integrate that into my true self identity. And that's really the deeper work in and around these things. So it's not just having self-awareness like, oh, I like the color blue. It's realizing that you can hurt people, and sometimes when you avoid them in relationships, it's not the best thing for a relationship, and you hurt the other person because you're abandoning them. And so there's an aspect of you that can abandon another human being. And it's about going into yourself and recognizing that and starting to come to terms with that part of you that can do that. And again, finding out the meaning behind why you are doing that is very important. And that's where the self-compassion comes in, the self-forgiveness comes in, etc. And this certainly then begins the journey into a more integrated self that's a lot more confident and authentic, and therefore aligned to their true values, and is not living according to other people's values, let's say, for example. So it's an integrated process. And that's a long answer to your question there, and quite a complicated answer. But
Yeah.
I think that's an important aspect to look at, yeah.
I don't think that was long or complicated. In actual fact,
Okay.
I am smiling from ear to ear because
Okay.
essentially it gets us to look at the fullness of self, appreciate yourself,
Yeah.
not just
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
cutesy
Yeah.
parts or not just the bitter parts, but everything that
Yeah.
is you. And I think,
Yeah.
Doctor, we will leave it at
Yeah.
that for now.
Right.
Another thing that I do think that we have to get an opportunity to talk about is that central nervous system that you keep on mentioning. You keep on
Right.
referencing it. And so I've been thinking, how does this play its role in our relationships? And so hopefully we'll have a chat with you about that soon, yes?
Right. Lovely. Look forward to that. Thank you so much.
The voice there of Dr. Neaves, that is Nicholas Neaves, a master counselor, pastoral narrative therapist who has written 2 books that I'd love to mention, Letters to Her, as well as Unbound Heart. And these addressing quite a variety of complex subject matters when it comes to relationships. Also, him just linking the depth of you knowing self to the way you express yourself in relationship. It's not just a hazy view of that cross-pollination. It is, in actual fact, so detailed, so meticulous that I would not want you to miss it. So if you have an opportunity to get that book, please tell us about it. Once you're done reading either Letters to Her by Dr. Nicholas Neaves or Unbound Heart, find us on WhatsApp, share your story, +27 83 288 6684.